Okay, this is a lecture about climate change, migration, and race. It is probably best viewed alongside the other migration lectures in the Connected Sociologies lecture series, although it can also be viewed alongside some of the other lecture series in the Connected Sociologies as well. I'm thinking in particular the one on racial capitalism. What I'd like to do in the talk is give you a way of thinking about the relationship between climate change, migration, and race in a way that diverges somewhat from conventional ways that people conceptualize climate change and human migration. So to start, let's have a look at some media images. These are all headlines, recent headlines from a number of different news media outlets: the Financial Times, the New York Times, Wired Magazine, The Guardian, and Rolling Stone Magazine. And all of them present a narrative in which climate change is constructed as a problem of migration. And the argument that is often conveyed in media narratives like this is that under conditions of climate change, we will see an increase in the number of people migrating. People, by virtue of sea level rise or climate induced drought or fire or extreme weather events, will be displaced from their homes and they will need to migrate. Whether they will migrate across an international border or domestically, these are sort of points for debate, if you like. But the broad narrative within contemporary media tends to fall along the lines of climate change is increasingly understood by the experts as a problem of migration. Now, on the one hand, this is a fairly easy argument to accept. What I'd like to do, though, is present you with a different argument, present you with a different set of ideas for thinking that there is more at stake in this narrative than simply what is presented to us in the media. So the argument, I'd like to, in fact, make two arguments. So the first argument that I'd like to make is that broadly, the international political discourse around climate change and human migration, the kind of discourse that we see in news media, but also that we see promulgated by international institutions, including, for example, the World Bank and the International Organization for Migration. The idea here is that the international political discourse on climate change and migration can be understood as a form of racial rule that has the appearance of governing so-called climate migrants and climate refugees, but is perhaps better understood as a political discourse that shores up Western humanism in the very planetary moment in which climate change is calling humanism into question. In other words, climate change is a threat to humanism, and the argument that I would like to suggest that we give some consideration to is that this discourse about climate change and migration is really about shoring up humanism in the moment that it confronts its end, if you like, climate change. So the argument is predicated on two main bodies of thought. The first can be encapsulated, I think, very simply in the work of the literary scholar Edward Said. Edward Said, of course, is very well known for the idea that European self-understanding, the idea that there is a European subject, comes into being in relation to its other. In other words, Europe only understands itself as Europe by virtue of the other that is not Europe. The European comes into being only in relation to the non-European subject. And in the act of representing its other, Europe ends up misrepresenting the other. Europe never offers an accurate account of the other, but in fact, part and parcel of the strategy of inventing Europe, of constructing Europe, is through the misrepresentation of the other. So this is one sort of body of theory, if you like, that informs the argument. The second is a body of theory that comes from Dipesh Chakrabarty, who over the last 12 years has been making a series of interventions around questions to do with climate change and the Anthropocene. And so in this particular paper, Chakrabarty makes the really important point that in becoming a geological force on the planet, we have also developed a form of collective existence that has no ontological dimension. Our thinking about ourselves now stretches our capacity for interpretive understanding. Now, what Dipesh Chakrabarty means by this is in the historical moment of climate change, or what some people refer to as the Anthropocene, human beings, the figure of the human in humanism, is no longer to be understood as separate from nature, as organizing and governing and managing nature. Nature is now actually, under conditions of climate change, returning with a vengeance and has a quality of agency that is unto itself. And the effect of this is that it presents a kind of instability for humanism. If humanism historically understood itself as separate from nature, climate change and the Anthropocene are really beginning to undo that sense of humanism. So the argument then is, if what Chakrabarty is presenting us with is an idea that climate change and the Anthropocene are profoundly destabilizing phenomena that really undermine and challenge what it means to be human, then my argument is that the international political discourse around climate change and migration is about bringing some measure of stability, ontological stability, to the human in the very moment that humans are being confronted by this dramatic destabilizing phenomena of climate change. So that's the first argument. And the second argument is that the figure of the climate migrant refugee, I think, can be understood as the other of climate change. And furthermore, I think we can argue that this figure is constructed racially. And what I mean by that is that the figure of the climate migrant refugee is a signifier of racial difference. It, in effect, means race. So if we accept that the figure of the climate migrant is the other of climate change, and this is a figure that is constructed racially, then the idea that the discourse on climate change and migration is about the restoration of a kind of humanism or the reinvigoration of humanism. What I'm trying to get at is that this is a restoration of whiteness as a particular form of power. Okay, let me try and explain this a little further. To do that, I want to consider a few racial tropes that are used to construct the other of climate change. Naturalization, the loss of political status, and recognition. And my argument is that these tropes all combine to construct the figure of the climate migrant outside the category of the human. In other words, these are technologies or tropes that in effect function as techniques of dehumanization. In other words, to render someone a climate migrant or a climate refugee is to position that person or group of people outside the category of the human. And what I want to part and parcel of the argument as well then is that in so doing, by constructing the climate migrant and the climate refugee outside the category of the human, This is one of the ways that humanism comes to redefine itself in the context of climate change. In other words, in the context of climate change, humanism is reinventing its other as the migrant other or as the climate refugee. So let's have a look at these tropes. The first trope is the trope of naturalization. And what I mean by this is that the figure of the climate migrant is understood to be a naturalized figure. The migrant's migration is explained in this case exclusively in terms of the geophysical effects of climate change, extreme weather events, sea level rise, drought, and so forth. These all are said to be the reason why climate migrants or climate refugees move in the first place. The problem, and this is a very easy kind of logic to accept when we look at it at face value. But I would suggest that when we think about so-called climate migrants and climate refugees, migration is actually naturalized. Migration is explained in terms of nature. And this is significant because another way of thinking about naturalization is dehistoricization. What is erased from discourses around climate change and human migration are the historical conditions that produce the vulnerability that expose people to climate change and which may in turn result in them having to migrate. So a really good example of this is the case of coastal Bangladesh. Coastal Bangladesh has undergone decades of Western economic development interventions that have really radically reconfigured the coastal landscape in Bangladesh. Just to give you a couple of examples, shrimp farming has become a very important source of foreign exchange for Bangladesh. Institutions like the World Bank actively encouraged Bangladesh to adopt shrimp farming as a means of raising foreign exchange. And the effect of this has been to radically transform the coastal landscape in Bangladesh, such that rural peasants are dispossessed of whatever land they might have had access to, and consequently have no choice but to enter into a much more vulnerable and precarious form of economic activity in the form of wage labor, working for shrimp farms. More recently, soft shell crab farming is now a really popular economic development strategy for coastal Bangladesh. And this history is really important because it helps to explain the vulnerability of those who inhabit coastal Bangladesh. Now, when migration is explained solely in terms of climate change, we forget this all too important history. And so consequently, migration is explained in terms of nature or climate change and not in terms of history. The migrant is, in effect, dehistoricized and naturalized. The second trope is that of the loss of political status. When people are defined as potential climate migrants or climate refugees, they're placed in a space of legal ambiguity. They are, in effect, positioned outside the law. The reason for this is that there is no legal category for a climate refugee or indeed a climate migrant. These are categories that have been simply invented. And to call someone a climate migrant or a climate refugee is to really push them outside the boundaries of law, if you like, and into a kind of ambiguous legal non-space, if you like. And consequently, people end up losing their political status. Now, this is significant, I think, because the act of stripping the other of its legal status is a long-standing feature of white rule. And we can think of this in terms of the history of slavery, where the slave, whatever political subjectivity an individual might have had prior to his or her enslavement, the act of enslavement is about the suspension or the removal of political status from that subject. We can tell a similar story about the suspension of political status in the context of apartheid. We can also think about this in relation to a whole range of different settler colonialisms. And so in this sense, it's not surprising that a number of Pacific Island ambassadors acknowledged their refusal to use the concept of the climate refugee. Their concern was that if they start to use the notion of the climate refugee to define the inhabitants of Pacific Islands, those people who they are ostensibly representing in the international system, they are in effect suspending the political status, the citizenship status of those citizens of the countries that they represent. So this is an historical example of Pacific Island ambassadors refusing this category of the climate change refugee. And then finally, the concept of recognition is a third racializing trope. It's a seemingly neutral concept, and it's also a concept that is really central to a lot of discourses around climate justice. The idea here is that we need to recognize climate refugees in law. And in doing so, this will confer a set of rights onto those who are displaced by climate change. And consequently, once people have rights as so-called climate refugees, then in principle, they will gain access to resources that could reverse the injustices of climate change. This is a really compelling and laudable political discourse. But recognition also has, as a political concept, it also has a really insalubrious history. It can function as a very powerful political ruse. It offers the promise of rights, but it's also predicated first and foremost on constructing the other as that which is unrecognizable. So the other is rendered first unrecognizable, and then subsequently it is rendered recognizable on terms set in and by the West. And I think this is a really, this notion of recognition is really evident in the discourse around climate change and migration. Climate refugees are first unrecognizable. There is no place in law for them, but they need to be recognized. We need to recognize people as climate refugees. However, the act of recognition is not politically benign. It is really, functions as a really important form of power insofar as recognizability occurs on terms that are set in and by those who do the recognition, those who recognize. And so this last point is simply that the voice of the other is made to speak as a climate migrant or as a climate refugee. The other is only recognizable if it speaks in ways that are legible and intelligible by those who recognize. And consequently, recognition ends up simply reaffirming a relation of power between those who recognize and those who are said to be lacking in recognition. So if we take each of these tropes, what I'm suggesting is that together they construct the climate migrant or climate refugee outside the category of the human, and consequently they work as racial tropes. So the figure of the climate migrant and the figure of the climate refugee, these are racial categories. They signify racial difference. Now, another element of the argument that I'm making is that the international discourse on climate change and human migration is a form of racial rule. that is primarily about shoring up humanism in the very moment that humanism is confronting this great cataclysmic planetary event of climate change. So, what is racial rule? Well, there are two different kinds of racial rule that David Theo Goldberg elaborates in his book, The Threat of Race. These are racial naturalism and racial historicism. Racial naturalism is simply the idea that the other is imagined as naturally inferior. It is said to be unchangeable or immutable, and is therefore subject to a particular form of coercion. And the historical examples of this would be chattel slavery, but also the apartheid system. Racial historicism is a form of racial rule that occurs when the other is imagined as developmentally immature. The other, in this case, is said to require education and development, and is therefore subject to a number of different technologies aimed at the other's historical transformation. So in the Canadian context, the residential school system from the 19th century that worked right up until throughout the 80s, up until the 90s, but also developmentalism from after the Second World War. Goldberg's idea is that both of these two forms of racial rule coincide with different historical forms of capitalism. What I would like us to think about is the way in which the discourse on climate change and migration operates as a form of racial rule, but one that differs from racial naturalism and racial historicism. And I'm calling this racial futurism. In racial futurism, the other is imagined as a potential future problem that must be governed and must be intervened upon so that it doesn't become a problem at some point in the future. And the technology that is used to govern this other is the technology of adaptation. We must teach the other how to adapt effectively to climate change so that the other does not become a problem. And so adaptation becomes the sort of governing logic, if you like, of humanism as humanism itself strives to adapt to climate change. So by way of a conclusion, what I want to suggest is that when we see the headlines on climate change and human migration, we also, I think, need to try and read beyond the headlines. There's more at stake in this discourse around climate change and human migration than news media headlines would suggest. And so instead, I think we need to ask the question, for whom is the climate migrant refugee? And my argument is that there really is no such thing as a climate migrant refugee. Really, the discourse on climate change and migration is a form of racial rule that whiteness, as a form of power, uses in order to adapt to climate change. Thanks for listening.